The plane landed with a familiar jolt, jolting me awake from a restless sleep. It was late, close to midnight, when I stepped off the plane and into the biting winter air. I'd been gone for 2 weeks, bouncing between New York and Seattle on a whirlwind of client meetings and business negotiations. The trip had been lucrative, the kind you couldn't turn down, but I was more than ready to be home. The Uber ride to the house was uneventful, the streets quiet under a layer of fresh snow. I thought about the usual things, how Rebecca, my wife, was likely curled up with her tea and a book, the soft glow of the fireplace casting shadows across the living room. Our house had always been her sanctuary, and she had a way of making it feel like one for me, too. When I finally arrived, the house was dark. I unlocked the door, careful not to make too much noise. Rebecca had always been a light sleeper. I set my bags down in the foyer and stood for a moment, letting the familiar scent of home fill my senses. But something felt off. It wasn't anything I could immediately place. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the house itself was holding its breath. I chalked it up to fatigue and the weight of being away from home for so long. "Rebecca?" I called softly as I walked toward the living room. I found her on the couch, half asleep with a blanket draped over her. Her favorite novel sat open on the coffee table. She stirred when she heard me, her eyes fluttering open. "Ryan," she murmured, sitting up with a sleepy smile. "You're back." "Yeah, just got in," I said, leaning down to kiss her. Her lips were warm, familiar. "Didn't mean to wake you." "It's okay," she said, brushing her hair out of her face. "I've missed you." "I miss you too." We exchanged the usual pleasantries. How was your trip? How are things at home? But something in her demeanor seemed guarded. Her smile was just a fraction too tight, her laughter forced. "You should get some rest," she said eventually, standing and gathering her blanket. "We'll catch up tomorrow." As she headed upstairs, I noticed the faintest hesitation in her steps, the way her hand lingered on the banister. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I went to bed that night, she was already asleep, her back to me. And when I wrapped my arms around her, I noticed something I hadn't before, a subtle firmness to her stomach. My breath caught in my throat. It was unmistakable. Rebecca was pregnant. But how? We hadn't been intimate in months, not since my travel schedule had ramped up and her mood had grown more distant. A cold chill ran through me as I lay there, staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep at all that night. Morning came too quickly. The house was quiet except for the occasional hum of the heater and the distant sound of birds chirping outside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the previous night on an endless loop. Rebecca had seemed so normal. Yet her behavior now carried a weight that hadn't been there before. And that belly, it wasn't my imagination. I knew what I'd felt. By the time I made my way downstairs, Rebecca was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. She'd always had a natural rhythm to her mornings, a calm efficiency that made everything look effortless. "Good morning," she said, glancing over her shoulder with a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. The smell of freshly brewed espresso filled the air, but I barely tasted it as I sipped. We ate in silence, the kind that usually felt companionable but now felt suffocating. I studied her out of the corner of my eye, how she moved, how she avoided looking at me for too long. "So," I began, breaking the silence. "How have you been?" Her hand paused mid-reach for the butter knife, just for a split second, before she recovered. "Oh, you know. Same as always. Emily's been a handful with her school projects, but nothing out of the ordinary." "Good." I nodded slowly, my heart pounding as I decided to press further. "You're looking different." "Different?" she repeated, her tone carefully neutral. I gestured vaguely. "Yeah. You seem, I don't know, healthier." Her smile faltered for just a second. "I've been working on myself," she said a little too quickly. "Eating better, doing yoga again." "Right," I said, forcing a small smile. But her answer didn't sit right with me. I wanted to ask her directly, to demand an explanation. But I didn't. Something in her posture warned me to tread carefully, as if the wrong move might shatter whatever fragile facade we were operating under. After breakfast, she busied herself tidying up, her movements quick and deliberate. I watched her from the doorway, my arms crossed. "Rebecca." She turned, her smile back in place but her eyes wary. "Yes? How far along are you?" Her hands froze, gripping the edge of the counter. The color drained from her face, and for a moment she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't do that," I said sharply, my voice low but firm. "I felt it. Last night. Your stomach." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she tried to busy herself with the dishes. I was going to tell you," she said finally, not meeting my gaze. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. "When?" She didn't answer. "Rebecca, look at me," I said, my tone more forceful. Slowly she turned, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Hurt me? Rebecca, what are you talking about? This should be good news." My voice cracked slightly. "It should be ours." Her expression crumpled, guilt etched across her face. That's when I knew. My legs felt like they might give out as the realization settled over me. "Rebecca, whose is it?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Ryan, please. Whose is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. She stepped back, her hands trembling. "It's not what you think," she whispered, but the words rang hollow. "Then tell me what it is!" I roared, the frustration and confusion boiling over. She broke down completely, covering her face with her hands as sobs racked her body. It's David's." The room spun. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. "David?" I repeated, the name feeling foreign in my mouth. "My brother." She nodded, her face crumpled in shame. "It wasn't. I didn't want it to happen," she choked out. "I swear, Ryan, it wasn't like that." I stared at her, the world around me dissolving into a haze of disbelief and anger. "My own brother. How could you?" I whispered, my voice trembling with rage. "How could he?" She tried to step toward me, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said coldly. "Don't come near me right now." And with that I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my head pounding with the weight of her betrayal. This was only the beginning. I didn't know how, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this go. I drove aimlessly for hours after leaving the house, the winter sky hanging gray and oppressive above me. My thoughts raced, tumbling over each other in a chaotic loop. Rebecca's confession, the way she looked at me, the name she'd said. David. My own brother. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. But Rebecca's face, the guilt, the shame, it had told me everything I needed to know. I ended up at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with peeling wallpaper and faded menus that hadn't changed in decades. I sat in a booth by the window, staring at the black coffee the waitress had poured for me. I thought about all the times I'd defended David over the years, the way I'd shrugged off his selfishness because, well, he was my brother. He'd always been the charming one, the golden boy who could talk his way out of anything. But this was unforgivable. I pulled up my phone, my thumb hovering over his name in my contact list. My hands shook as I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to unleash all the rage simmering inside me. But another part, a colder, calculating part, knew I needed more. If David had betrayed me, I needed to hear it from him. I needed to make him admit it. I pressed the call button. It rang twice before he picked up. "Hey, man," David said, his voice casual, almost cheerful. "What's up?" I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Where are you right now?" There was a pause, just long enough to make me suspicious. Home." "Why?" I need to see you, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Now. David hesitated again. Everything okay? Just meet me at Mom and Dad's old place, I said. The house had been sitting empty since our parents retired to Florida, but it was familiar, neutral ground. All right, he said finally. I'll be there in 20. I hung up without another word. 20 minutes felt like an eternity as I waited in the living room of the old house, pacing back and forth across the creaking hardwood floors. My anger was a slow burn now, simmering just beneath the surface. When David finally arrived, he stepped inside with his usual easy confidence, though his smile faltered when he saw my expression. What's going on, Ryan? He asked, closing the door behind him. I stared at him, barely able to contain myself. How long? David frowned, confused. How long what? Don't play dumb with me, I snapped, my voice sharp. How long have you been sleeping with my wife? His face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. What are you talking about? Don't lie to me, I roared, taking a step closer. Rebecca told me everything. He flinched at her name, and that was all the confirmation I needed. It wasn't like that, he stammered, holding up his hands as if to placate me. I didn't mean for it to happen. Oh, you didn't mean for it to happen? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You accidentally slept with my wife? Accidentally got her pregnant? David's eyes widened. She's pregnant? The shock on his face seemed genuine, but it only made me angrier. You didn't even know? I spat. You've wrecked my life, and you didn't even know. He ran a hand through his hair, his face contorted with guilt. Look, I'm sorry, okay? I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened. Stop saying that, I growled, my fists clenching. You don't just happen to betray your own brother. You made a choice, David. A deliberate, disgusting choice. He sat down heavily on the couch, burying his face in his hands. I was drunk. We both were. It was after Thanksgiving, remember? You were out of town, and we ran into each other at a bar. I clenched my jaw, my mind flashing back to that week. I'd been in Chicago for a conference, completely unaware of the storm brewing back home. It was just once, David continued, his voice muffled. I swear. And after that we stopped. She said she couldn't do that to you. I stared at him, my chest heaving with barely contained fury. You expect me to believe that? It's the truth, he insisted, looking up at me with pleading eyes. I messed up, Ryan. I know I did. But I didn't mean for this to go this far. My hands shook as I resisted the urge to hit him, to wipe that pathetic look off his face. Instead, I turned away, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Doesn't matter, I said finally, my voice cold. Once is enough. You've destroyed everything. David stood, his expression desperate. Ryan, please. Get out, I said, cutting him off. Get out of this house, and stay the hell away from me and my family. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else, but the look on my face must have stopped him. He nodded slowly and walked out, the door closing behind him with a hollow thud. As the silence settled over the room, I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. My wife had betrayed me. My brother had betrayed me. And now, I was going to make them pay. I stayed in the old house long after David left, sitting in the cold silence, trying to make sense of the chaos. My hands were still trembling, not from fear but from the sheer force of the anger boiling inside me. Betrayal was one thing, but this? This was humiliation. The drive home was a blur. Snow had started to fall again, the thin flakes swirling in the headlights as I navigated the empty streets. By the time I walked through the door, Rebecca was sitting in the living room, her knees tucked up to her chest like she'd been waiting for me. She looked up the moment she heard me. Her face was pale, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Where have you been? She asked softly. Talking to David, I said flatly, shutting the door behind me. Her reaction was immediate. She flinched like I'd slapped her, her eyes darting away. What did he tell you? Everything, I said, my voice ice cold. How it just happened. How you were both drunk. How it was only once. Is that true, Rebecca? Just once? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her hands twisted in her lap, a nervous tic I'd seen 100 times before. Answer me! I snapped, my voice rising. Yes, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It was just once. After Thanksgiving. I didn't know how to tell you. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh even to my own ears. Didn't know how to tell me? You didn't think I deserved to know? I was scared, she said, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want to lose you, Ryan. I didn't want to lose our family. Well, congratulations, I said, my voice dripping with venom. You managed to lose it anyway. She broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. But I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Not this time. I need to know one thing, I said, my tone hard. Was it really just once? Or are you lying to me again? She looked up, her face streaked with tears. It was just once, she said, her voice trembling. I swear, Ryan. I swear on everything. I stared at her, searching for any sign of deceit. But whether she was telling the truth or not, it didn't matter. The damage was done. Do you even understand what you've done? I asked, my voice low but furious. Do you know what it feels like to come home and find out that everything you thought was real is a lie? I'm sorry, she whispered, her hands clutching at the blanket around her. I'm so sorry. Sorry isn't good enough, I said sharply. Sorry doesn't erase what you've done. It doesn't fix this mess. She didn't respond, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a moment I thought about walking out the door again, just to get away from her, from the suffocating weight of her betrayal. But instead, I turned and headed upstairs, leaving her alone in the living room. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Emily's laughter echoing through the house. It was a cruel reminder of the life we'd built, the life that was now hanging by a thread. I made my way downstairs, where Rebecca was helping Emily with her breakfast. She glanced at me, her expression wary, but said nothing. Good morning, Dad. Emily chirped, her bright smile cutting through the tension like a knife. Morning, kiddo, I said, forcing a smile for her sake. Rebecca handed me a cup of coffee without a word, and we sat in silence as Emily chattered about her upcoming school project. For a brief moment, I let myself believe that things were normal, that the weight on my chest was just a bad dream. But the illusion shattered when Rebecca caught my eye, her gaze filled with guilt. I looked away, unable to stomach it. After Emily left for school, Rebecca tried to talk to me again. Ryan, she began, her voice trembling. We need to figure out how to move forward. For Emily's sake. I turned to face her, my jaw tight. Move forward? I repeated. You want to pretend like everything's fine? Like you didn't destroy our marriage? I don't want to pretend, she said, tears welling up again. I want to fix this. Please, Ryan. We can fix this. I shook my head, laughing bitterly. Fix it? Rebecca, there's no fixing this. You slept with my brother. My brother. And now you're carrying his child. She flinched at my words, her hands clutching the counter for support. I made a mistake, she said, her voice breaking. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But I still love you. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. You can't make this right, I said coldly. You can't undo what's been done. She started to sob again, but I felt no sympathy. My heart was hardened now, my focus shifting to something else entirely. David had as much to answer for as she did. And he would. The rest of the day passed in a haze of simmering anger and cold calculation. Every time I looked at Rebecca, my mind flashed back to her confession, to David's pathetic attempts to justify himself. They thought they could betray me and walk away with a few apologies and some tears. They had no idea what I was capable of. That night, After Emily was asleep, I cornered Rebecca in the living room. She was curled up on the couch, her eyes red and puffy. When she saw me, she stiffened, her grip tightening on the blanket draped over her legs. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sharp. She nodded wordlessly, her face pale. "First of all, you're going to tell Emily the truth." Her eyes widened. "Ryan, no, she's too young to understand." "She's not too young to see what's happening," I interrupted, my tone cold. "You don't get to drag her into your mess and then hide behind her innocence. She deserves to know why her family is falling apart." Rebecca looked like she might argue, but the look on my face must have stopped her. She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping. "Second," I continued, "you're going to leave this house. Tonight." Her head snapped up, panic flashing across her face. "Ryan, please, where am I supposed to go?" "That's not my problem," I said flatly. "You can go to a friend's house. Or better yet, go to David's. The two of you seem to have plenty to talk about." She flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't want to go to David's. I want to stay here, with you. With Emily." "You lost that right the moment you decided to betray me," I said, my voice hard. "Pack your things, Rebecca. I'll handle Emily while you figure out what's next." She started to sob, clutching at the blanket like it was the only thing keeping her upright. But I felt no sympathy, no urge to comfort her. Not anymore. After a few minutes she stood, her movements slow and reluctant. "I'll pack a bag," she said quietly, her voice trembling. I nodded once, watching her disappear up the stairs. When she was out of sight, I sat down on the couch, my hands shaking. This wasn't just anger anymore, it was something colder, darker. I wasn't going to let Rebecca or David off the hook. They needed to feel the weight of what they'd done. Rebecca left that night, her suitcase in hand, tears streaming down her face as she whispered a goodbye to Emily. I watched her drive away, the taillights disappearing into the night. But my work was just beginning. The next morning, after dropping Emily off at school, I made a call. "Dan," I said when my brother picked up. "It's Ryan." "Ryan?" Daniel sounded confused. "What's going on?" "It's early. I need your help," I said, my voice cold. "It's about David." There was a pause, and then Daniel's voice hardened. "What did he do?" I told him everything, the affair, the pregnancy, Rebecca's betrayal. By the time I finished, Daniel was silent. "He crossed the line, Ryan," Daniel said finally, his voice low and deadly. "Tell me what you need." "I need him to pay," I said simply. "And I have a plan." Over the next week, I worked with Daniel to unravel David's carefully curated life. He was the golden boy of the family, the successful one everyone admired. But I knew his weaknesses, the cracks in his armor he thought no one saw. First, I dug into his professional life. David worked for an investment firm, managing accounts for high-profile clients. It didn't take much to find a few questionable deals he'd made over the years, the kind of things his company wouldn't want to see splashed across the headlines. I sent an anonymous tip to his firm's compliance department, attaching copies of the evidence I'd collected. Within days, whispers of an internal investigation began to circulate. Next, I went after his personal life. David had always been a charmer, the type who thrived on attention. But his social media accounts painted a different picture, a man desperate for validation, posting photos and updates that barely hid his insecurities. I used that to my advantage, crafting a series of messages that hinted at his affair with Rebecca. The messages were anonymous but carefully worded, sent to mutual friends and colleagues who wouldn't hesitate to spread the gossip. By the end of the week, David's reputation was in tatters. His firm put him on leave pending the investigation, and his social circle began to distance themselves. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The final blow came a week later. Rebecca called me, her voice trembling as she begged for another chance. "Ryan, please," she said. "I've been staying with my sister, but I can't do this anymore. I need to come home. For Emily. For us." I felt a cold smile tug at my lips. For us? I repeated. There is no us, Rebecca. There hasn't been for a long time. Don't say that, she whispered. We can fix this. No, I said, my voice firm. We can't. And if you want to fight for custody of Emily, I'll make sure the court knows exactly what kind of person you are. She started to cry, but I hung up before she could say anything else. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even closure. It was the beginning of my revenge. A week had passed since Rebecca had left the house, and though her betrayal still burned, my anger had begun to shift. It wasn't cooling, it was merely redirecting itself toward the man who had made this entire situation unbearable. David. I had inflicted plenty of damage already. His career was hanging by a thread, his reputation shredded by whispers of scandal. But it wasn't enough. He hadn't just betrayed me, he had manipulated Rebecca, taken advantage of the cracks in our marriage to push her over the edge. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake one nagging question: why? Why had David done it? What had possessed him to cross such an unforgivable line? That question was answered sooner than I expected. Rebecca called me late one night, her voice trembling but determined. Ryan, she said, we need to talk. What could we possibly have to talk about? I asked coldly, my grip tightening on the phone. It's about David, she said quickly. There's something you don't know. Something I should have told you from the beginning. I paused, her words catching me off guard. What are you talking about? Can I come over? She asked, her tone pleading. Please. I can't do this over the phone. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her to deal with her mess on her own. But the desperation in her voice, the fear, gave me pause. Fine, I said reluctantly. But don't think this changes anything. When Rebecca arrived, she looked like a shadow of the woman I once knew. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with dark circles, and she clutched her coat tightly around herself like it was armor. What is it? I asked, crossing my arms as I stood in the doorway. She hesitated, her gaze darting past me toward the stairs. Is Emily here? She's asleep, I said curtly. Now talk. Rebecca stepped inside, her hands twisting nervously. David, it wasn't just the affair. What does that mean? I demanded. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. He blackmailed me, Ryan. He forced me into it. The words hit me like a freight train. What are you talking about? I told him something, she said, her voice cracking. Something stupid, something I shouldn't have. It was after Thanksgiving at that bar. I was drunk, and I was venting about how distant things had felt between us. I didn't mean to, but I said too much. I stared at her, my stomach sinking. Too much? What did you tell him, Rebecca? She hesitated, tears streaming down her face. I told him about the money. What money? I asked sharply. The savings account, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd been dipping into it for months, using it to pay off some credit card debt. I didn't want to tell you because I was afraid you'd be angry. And David, he found out. He said if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd tell you everything. My chest tightened, fury bubbling to the surface. So you let him manipulate you? You let him use you as leverage against me? I didn't know what else to do, she cried. He said he'd ruin everything, that he'd tell you, and then he'd tell the family, and that you'd never forgive me. And you thought this was the better option? I asked, my voice rising. To sleep with him? To betray me in the worst possible way? I wasn't thinking, she sobbed. I was scared, Ryan. I didn't know how to stop him. I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process what she was saying. David hadn't just betrayed me, he'd manipulated Rebecca, exploited her vulnerability for his own gain. This doesn't excuse what you did, I said finally, my voice cold. But it changes things. Rebecca looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? It means David didn't just betray me. He didn't just ruin my marriage. He's a predator, I said, my fist clenching. And we're going to make him pay. Rebecca was hesitant at first, unsure of what I meant by making him pay. But the more I explained, the more determined she became. David's power came from manipulation, from the secrets he held over people. If we could expose those secrets, if we could turn his own tactics against him, we could destroy him completely. Step 1 was simple: gather evidence. Rebecca had saved some of the texts David had sent her, messages that hinted at his threats and his willingness to exploit her fear. I combined those with the evidence I already had: records of his shady business deals, screenshots of conversations he'd had with other women. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about showing the world who David really was. The plan came together over the next few days. Rebecca and I worked late into the night, poring over documents and crafting a narrative that would make David's house of cards collapse. By the time we were done, we had everything we needed. The final step was putting it all into motion. I reached out to a journalist I knew, someone with a reputation for uncovering scandals. He was eager to help, especially once he saw the mountain of evidence we'd collected. The story broke a week later. High-profile investor accused of coercion, misconduct, and fraud. David's face was plastered across every news site and social media platform. The article didn't pull any punches, detailing his manipulative behavior, his threats, and his unethical business practices. It painted a picture of a man who had used his charm and influence to take advantage of others, both personally and professionally. The fallout was immediate. His firm fired him within hours, releasing a statement condemning his actions. His friends and colleagues distanced themselves, and his reputation was shattered beyond repair. But the real victory came when he called me, his voice trembling with desperation. "Ryan," he said, "you have to help me. This is all lies, it's been twisted." "No, David," I said calmly. "It's the truth. And it's exactly what you deserve." I hung up, a cold sense of satisfaction settling over me. David had taken everything from me. Now I'd taken everything from him. The house was eerily quiet the morning after David's downfall hit the news. Emily was at school, Rebecca had gone back to stay with her sister, and for the first time in weeks, I was alone. I sat at the kitchen table, the morning paper spread out in front of me. David's face stared back at me from the front page, a stark reminder of everything that had unraveled. Disgraced investor faces allegations of coercion and fraud. The article was thorough, almost surgical in its precision. Every secret, every dirty little trick he'd ever pulled, was laid bare for the world to see. And while a part of me felt satisfied, another part felt empty. The revenge was complete, but the damage remained. My marriage was shattered, my trust obliterated, and Emily's life uprooted in ways she couldn't yet understand. And then there was Rebecca. I hadn't seen her since the story broke. She'd sent me a single text the night before, thanking me for letting her help expose David and apologizing, again, for everything that had happened. I didn't reply. I didn't know how. What was left to say? Later that afternoon, Rebecca called. I stared at my phone as it rang, debating whether to answer. Finally, I picked up. "Ryan," she said, her voice tentative. "Can we talk?" "About what?" I asked, my tone clipped. "About everything," she said. "Please. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I need to see you. Just once." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Fine. Come over tonight. After Emily's asleep." "Thank you," she said softly, relief evident in her voice. When Rebecca arrived that evening, she looked worn down but determined. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Thank you for letting me come," she began. "Just get to the point," I said, my voice cold. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know I can't undo what I've done. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to repair. But I need you to understand that I never wanted this. I never wanted to lose you." "You didn't just lose me, Rebecca," I said sharply. You destroyed everything we built. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed Emily. You betrayed our family." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I know," she said. "And I hate myself for it. I've been working with a counselor, trying to understand why I let it happen. And I've realized something I wish I'd understood sooner." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I was weak," she said, her voice trembling. "I let my insecurities, my fears, control me. I let David manipulate me because I was too afraid to face the truth about myself. And in the process, I hurt the person I love most." I scoffed, leaning back in my chair. "Love? You don't do this to someone you love, Rebecca." "You're right," she said, her tears spilling over. "I didn't love you the way you deserved. I wasn't the partner you needed. But I want to be better, for Emily, for myself. And maybe one day, if you can ever forgive me for you." I stared at her, my chest tightening. Her words felt genuine, but I didn't know if I could trust her again. "Forgiveness isn't something you can just ask for, Rebecca," I said finally. "It's something you have to earn. And right now, I don't even know if it's possible." She nodded, her expression heavy with sorrow. "I understand. I just needed you to know that I'm trying. And I'll keep trying, no matter how long it takes." We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything hanging between us. "Go home," I said eventually. "We'll figure out how to co-parent. But that's all I can promise right now." She stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "Thank you, Ryan," she said softly, "for giving me a chance to speak." I didn't reply, and she left without another word. After she was gone, I sat alone in the quiet house, my thoughts racing. Rebecca's words lingered in my mind, a painful reminder of the life we'd once shared and the wreckage that remained. Could I forgive her? Could I ever trust her again? I didn't know. But one thing was clear: this was only the beginning of the healing process, for me, for Emily, and maybe even for Rebecca. In the days that followed Rebecca's visit, I threw myself into a new routine. Emily was my priority, my anchor. Every laugh, every question she asked, every smile she gave me was a reminder that I still had something worth fighting for. But Rebecca's words lingered in the back of my mind, no matter how much I tried to push them away. I told myself I didn't care if she was working on herself, that her apologies meant nothing. And yet, every time I closed my eyes, I thought about what she'd said. "I want to be better, for Emily, for myself." Emily was still blissfully unaware of the full scope of what had happened. She asked about her mother often, wanting to know when she'd come home. I kept my answers vague, promising her that Mommy still loved her and that we were figuring things out. But my answers weren't enough to satisfy her for long. One evening, as I tucked Emily into bed, she looked up at me with wide, questioning eyes. "Daddy, are you and Mommy mad at each other?" I froze, my throat tightening. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" She fiddled with the edge of her blanket, avoiding my gaze. "Because she doesn't live here anymore. And you look sad when I talk about her." I forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "Mommy and I are going through a hard time right now," I said carefully. "But we both love you very much. That will never change." "Will she come back?" Emily asked, her voice small. I hesitated, my chest aching at the hope in her eyes. "I don't know," I admitted. "But no matter what happens, we'll always be a family." She nodded slowly, though I could see the confusion and sadness lingering in her expression. The next weekend, Rebecca and I met at a park to exchange Emily. It was the first time I'd seen her since she'd come to the house, and though she looked calmer, the tension between us was palpable. Emily ran ahead to the swings, leaving Rebecca and me standing awkwardly near the picnic tables. "She talks about you all the time," Rebecca said softly, watching Emily play. "She misses you?" "She misses you too," I replied, my tone guarded. Rebecca hesitated, then turned to face me. "Have you thought about what I said? About trying to work together, for Emily's sake?" I crossed my arms, studying her. "I've thought about a lot of things," I said carefully. But Rebecca, you don't get to ask for things on your timeline. I'm still trying to figure out how to rebuild my life after what you and David did. She flinched at his name, guilt flashing across her face. I know, she said. And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want to show you that I'm serious about making things right. How? I asked, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated, then pulled out a small notebook from her bag. I've been working on something with my counselor, she said, handing it to me. It's a journal. Letters to you, to Emily, to myself. I thought maybe it would help you understand. I took the notebook reluctantly, flipping through the pages. Her handwriting filled every line, raw and unfiltered. What do you want me to do with this? I asked. Read it, she said quietly. Or don't. It's up to you. But I needed to give it to you. I stared at her, torn between anger and a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Finally, I slipped the notebook into my coat pocket. I'll think about it, I said, my voice neutral. Rebecca nodded, a small, hopeful smile tugging at her lips. That's all I can ask. That night, after Emily was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with Rebecca's notebook in front of me. I stared at it for what felt like hours, debating whether to open it. Finally, with a deep breath, I flipped to the first page. Ryan, the letter began, her handwriting shaky but deliberate. I know you don't want to hear from me right now, and I don't blame you. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for what I did, but for the ways I let our marriage fall apart. For the times I should have spoken up but didn't. For the times I put my fears above your trust. Her words were raw, unpolished, and painfully honest. She wrote about her regrets, her mistakes, and the things she wished she'd done differently. She wrote about Emily, about the guilt she felt for dragging her into the fallout of our choices. By the time I reached the last page, my chest felt heavy with conflicting emotions. The anger was still there, but so was something else, a glimmer of understanding. I didn't know what it meant, or if it would change anything. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The next few weeks were an uneasy balancing act. Rebecca and I exchanged Emily for her scheduled visits, always in public places to avoid the lingering tension boiling over. Our conversations remained short, stiff, and mostly about logistics, drop-off times, school projects, what Emily needed for the upcoming week. But every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of the Rebecca I used to know, the gentle way she brushed a stray hair from Emily's face, the genuine warmth in her smile when Emily laughed. And every time, I'd feel the same pang of bitterness, a reminder that the person I once trusted was no longer whole in my eyes. I hadn't told anyone outside of Rebecca about the contents of her journal, not even my brother Daniel, who had been my steadfast ally throughout all this. But the words in those pages had stayed with me, nudging at the edges of my anger like a persistent whisper, she's trying. She's trying. Still, forgiveness felt like an impossible bridge to cross. It was a cold, rainy afternoon when the next piece of the puzzle fell into place. I was at home, reviewing a proposal for work, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ryan, it's David. We need to talk. I stared at the screen, my pulse spiking. The nerve of him, to reach out after everything. I didn't reply at first. But as the minutes ticked by, curiosity and rage wrestled for control. Finally, I sent back a single word, why? His response came almost immediately, there's something you don't know about Rebecca. Please meet me. I debated ignoring him, but the mention of Rebecca hooked me. If there was more to the story, I needed to know. I agreed to meet him at a nearby coffee shop later that evening, my stomach churning the entire drive there. David was already seated when I arrived, his once confident demeanor replaced with something far less composed. His shoulders were slouched, his eyes hollow, and he looked years older than the last time I'd seen him. Ryan, he began, his voice low. Thanks for coming. Cut the small talk, I said coldly, sitting across from him. What do you want? He winced but didn't argue. I just wanted to explain. To tell you the truth about what happened. I already know the truth, I snapped. You blackmailed my wife and ruined my marriage. He flinched at my words but nodded. I know. And I deserve everything I'm getting. But there's more to it than that. Get to the point, I said, my patience wearing thin. David took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he fidgeted with his coffee cup. Rebecca didn't just cheat on you because I pressured her. I mean, yes, I blackmailed her, but there was more. She was angry. Angry at you for being gone so much, for prioritizing work over her. She told me she felt invisible. My stomach twisted. And you took advantage of that, I said bitterly. Yes, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But she wasn't just a victim. She was complicit, Ryan. She made choices, just like I did. Why are you telling me this? I demanded, my anger bubbling to the surface. Because, he hesitated, looking genuinely remorseful for the first time. Because I've lost everything, and I don't want you to make the same mistake. I can see it in your eyes, you're consumed by this, just like I was when I started down this path. It'll eat you alive, Ryan. I stared at him, my chest tight with fury and disbelief. You don't get to lecture me about consequences, David. You don't get to act like the wise one now. I'm not, he said quietly. I just wanted to try to make things right, even if it's too late for me. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. You don't get to make things right, David. You made your choices. Now live with them. I walked out without looking back, my mind racing. That night, I found myself pacing in the kitchen, replaying David's words over and over. As much as I hated him, some part of me couldn't shake the grain of truth in what he'd said. Rebecca had made choices. And I'd made choices, too, choices that had left cracks in our marriage long before David entered the picture. It wasn't an excuse for what they'd done, but it was a sobering reminder that I wasn't blameless in all of this. Later, when Emily was asleep, I called Rebecca. Ryan? She answered, her voice cautious. We need to talk, I said, the words heavy on my tongue. Okay, she said softly. When? Tomorrow, I said. I'll come to your sister's place after work. Thank you, she whispered, and I hung up without responding. The next evening, I arrived at her sister's house, my chest tight with apprehension. Rebecca opened the door, her face a mix of relief and nervousness. Come in, she said, stepping aside. We sat in the living room, the tension between us palpable. I spoke to David, I said bluntly, watching her reaction. Her eyes widened, and she nodded slowly. What did he say? He told me you were angry. That you felt invisible. Rebecca looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. I did, she admitted. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I should have come to you. I should have fought for us instead of giving up. I studied her, my emotions a tangled mess. You're right, I said finally. You should have. But I wasn't perfect either. I let work consume me. I stopped paying attention to the little things, the things that mattered to you. Rebecca looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. Ryan, I know I've ruined everything. But I want to fix this, not for us, but for Emily. She deserves parents who can at least be civil to each other. I nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over me. For Emily, I said. That's all this is about now. Her shoulders slumped with relief, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, not for us, but for the possibility of coexisting in a way that wouldn't destroy our daughter. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a start. The weeks that followed were filled with tentative steps, small but significant strides toward rebuilding a semblance of normalcy for Emily. Rebecca and I worked together to create a schedule that kept her life as consistent as possible: school drop-offs, playdates, weekend visits. We coordinated without the bitterness that had colored our earlier exchanges, focusing on one goal: giving Emily a safe, stable environment. But outside of those moments, the wounds were still raw. Every time Rebecca and I were in the same room, there was an unspoken tension, a lingering ghost of the betrayal that had shattered our lives. She was trying, though. I couldn't deny that. She attended counseling regularly, kept her promises, and made every effort to put Emily first. And me? I was trying too. Trying to let go of the anger, the bitterness, the weight of what had been taken from me. One evening, as I was helping Emily with her homework, she looked up at me with that same curious expression that always made my chest tighten. "Daddy," she asked, "are you and Mommy friends again?" Her question caught me off guard. I set down the pencil I'd been holding, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. "We're trying," I said carefully. Emily tilted her head, studying me. "Do you still love her?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I'll always care about her," I said finally. "Because she's your mom, and we both love you more than anything." Emily seemed satisfied with that answer, returning to her math problems with a contented smile. But her question lingered in my mind long after she'd gone to bed. A month later, we had our first family outing since the fallout. Emily's school was hosting a fall festival, and she begged us to attend together. Rebecca and I both agreed, though I could see the nervousness in her eyes when we met at the entrance. She was holding Emily's hand, her other arm resting protectively over her still small belly. "Hey," she said softly, offering a tentative smile. "Hey," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. For Emily's sake, we put on a united front. We walked through the festival together, watching her play games, laugh with her friends, and stuff her face with cotton candy. Her happiness was contagious, and for a few fleeting moments, I let myself forget about the past. Rebecca and I even laughed together at one point, when Emily insisted we both join her on the hayride. It was a small, almost fragile moment of connection, but it felt like progress. As the weeks turned into months, Rebecca and I settled into a rhythm. Our co-parenting dynamic grew stronger, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared commitment to Emily's well-being. We weren't friends, not exactly, but we weren't enemies anymore either. I started to notice small changes in Rebecca, ways she was working to rebuild herself. She found a part-time job, joined a local support group for single parents, and continued her counseling sessions. She even wrote me another letter, thanking me for giving her the chance to be a part of Emily's life and promising to continue earning my trust. I didn't write back, but I read her words carefully. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He hadn't brought up the situation with David since the fallout, but I knew he'd been keeping tabs on everything. "How's it going?" he asked, leaning against the counter. I shrugged. "It's better. Not perfect, but better. That's all you can ask for, right?" he said, his tone thoughtful. "Yeah," I said, setting a plate in the sink. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive her, or David. But I think I'm learning how to live with it." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "You've come a long way, Ryan. You're doing the right thing for Emily. And for yourself." I didn't respond, but his words stayed with me long after he left. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place one chilly afternoon in late spring. Rebecca called me, asking if we could meet for coffee while Emily was at a friend's house. I hesitated but agreed, curious about what she wanted to say. We sat across from each other at a small cafe, the awkwardness between us less pronounced than it had been months ago. "Thanks for coming," she said, stirring her tea. "What's this about?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Rebecca took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her spoon. "I wanted to tell you. I've decided to move." I blinked, caught off guard. "Move?" "Not far," she said quickly. "Just to a place closer to my new job. It's a better neighborhood for the baby, and it'll give me a fresh start." I studied her, unsure how to feel. "You're sure about this?" She nodded. "It's time. I can't keep clinging to the past, Ryan. I need to build a life for myself, and for the baby, that isn't weighed down by everything I've done." I sat back, processing her words. "I think that's a good idea," I said finally. "For you. For Emily." Rebecca smiled, a small, bittersweet expression. "Thank you. For everything, for giving me a chance to be part of Emily's life, even after everything I put you through. You're her mom. I said simply. That's what matters. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. As I watched her walk away, I felt a strange sense of closure. Our story wasn't one of reconciliation or fairy tale endings, but it wasn't a tragedy either. It was a story of consequences, growth, and learning to live with the scars we'd left on each other. In the end, I didn't forgive Rebecca. But I let go of the anger, the bitterness that had consumed me for so long. And as Emily ran into my arms that evening, laughing about her day with her friends, I realized that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing to move forward, step by step, one day at a time. And for now, that was enough. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.